Napoleon, the army that vanished. Napoleon marched into Russia with more than 600,000 men. 6 months later, fewer than 1 in 5 marched back out. This wasn't a story about one big battle. Nobody wiped this army out in a single afternoon. It just slowly, horribly disappeared. And the strangest part is, the man who caused it saw the whole thing coming apart and couldn't stop it. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte basically ran Europe. He'd beaten every major power that stood against him, and his empire stretched across the continent. But one country wouldn't fully play along: Russia. So Napoleon decided to teach it a lesson, and he built the largest army the world had ever seen to do it. Over 600,000 soldiers, not just Frenchmen either, Germans, Poles, Italians, Austrians, soldiers from a dozen different nations, all marching under one flag toward Russia. On paper, it looked unstoppable. Part of the reason Napoleon wanted Russia in line was trade. He tried to cripple Britain, his biggest remaining enemy, by cutting off all Europe's trade with him. Russia had quietly started ignoring that rule, trading with Britain anyway. To Napoleon, that wasn't just broken promise, it was a challenge he couldn't ignore. Here's the twist nobody expected. The Russians didn't even try to fight this massive army head-on. Instead, they retreated, again and again. They burned their own fields, their own villages, anything Napoleon's army might use for food or shelter, and kept pulling back deeper into Russia. Napoleon's army needed to live off the land as it marched, because moving enough supplies for 600,000 men was almost impossible. But there was no land left to live off, just ash and empty villages. Within the first 8 weeks, before a single major battle had even been fought, Napoleon's army had already shrunk by a third. Not from fighting, from disease, hunger, and simply falling behind on an endless march through nowhere. Along the way, the two sides finally clashed head-on near a village called Borodino. It turned into the bloodiest single day of the entire war. Tens of thousands of men killed or wounded in one afternoon. Napoleon technically won the battle, but the Russian army wasn't destroyed. It simply retreated again, leaving the road to Moscow wide open. Then came Moscow. In September, Napoleon's army finally reached the city, expecting the Russians to surrender. Instead, they found it almost completely empty, and that night fires broke out across Moscow, deliberately set, burning most of the city to the ground. Napoleon had won the city. There was nothing left to win. He waited in the ruins for over a month, hoping the Russian Tsar would come and negotiate peace. Nobody came, and here's the number that changed everything. It was already October. Winter in Russia doesn't wait for anyone, and Napoleon had just wasted his last chance to get his army out before it hit. So he ordered the retreat, and that's when things stopped being a war and started being a horror story. Temperatures dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero. Soldiers had no proper winter gear because nobody had planned for the campaign to last this long. Horses froze and dropped dead in their tracks. Men fell asleep, marching, and simply never woke up. And the Russians weren't finished. Small, fast-moving groups of Russian soldiers harassed retreating French the entire way, picking off stragglers, striking and vanishing before Napoleon's exhausted men could fight back. At one river crossing, thousands of soldiers died in a single chaotic scramble to escape. Some crushed, some drowned, some cut down while trying to cross. By the time what was left of the army finally staggered out of Russia, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. Of more than 600,000 men who marched in that summer, only around 100,000 made it back out. The rest were dead, missing or captured. An army that size doesn't just lose a war, it practically stops existing. Here's the part historians still argue about. Napoleon wasn't crushed in one decisive battle by a brilliant enemy general. His army was mostly destroyed by hunger, disease, distance, and weather. Three forces no amount of military genius could outfight. Word of the disaster spread fast across Europe. For years, Napoleon has seemed unbeatable. Now, every country he'd conquered started wondering if he actually was. Within 2 years, his enemies had teamed up, defeated him, and sent him into exile on a small island. He escaped once, tried to reclaim his empire, and was finally beaten for good at the Battle of Waterloo. So what really destroyed the greatest army in the world? Not a rival general, not a secret weapon, just distance and burned country with nothing left to give, and a Russian winter that didn't care who Napoleon was. And that's how one overconfident invasion 600,000 men strong turned into one of the greatest military disasters in history, and the beginning of the end for a man who thought he couldn't lose.